So welcome, Shalom. We'll begin, and I hope people can join us as we continue. Shalom, Lois. I'll ask Francie to introduce you, and just the general way we're going to do this evening is we're going to have half an hour of learning from Lois here, and then afterwards there's going to be a Q&A. So Francie, bevakasha. Francie, you're muted. You're muted.
Welcome, everyone, especially welcome, Lois. Thank you so much for doing this. Lois Roman is a trustee of the Memorial Scrolls Trust, or the MST, and serves as the U.S. representative on the East Coast and gets to go to London to coincidentally see her daughter when she's there on business. The MST is a London-based nonprofit which oversees the legacy of 1,564 Czechoslovakian Torah scrolls that survived the Shoah. After a miraculous story of survival, which we'll hear more about, I think, tonight, these scrolls arrived in London, England. They were dispersed on a permanent loan to caring communities around the world, and Temple Beth Ora is lucky to be one of the recipients. And Caitlin Donaldson, thank you for coming, Caitlin, who represents the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. They also have one of those Torah scrolls. Lois began her involvement with the MST several years ago, following a long career on Wall Street as a money manager. She has an MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from the Fish Center at Yeshiva University, an undergrad degree from Brandeis University, and an MBA from Columbia Business School. We are just so appreciative of your coming, and it's a couple hours later there. So thank you so much for making the time to do this, Lois. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Shavua Tov, everybody. I hope I can brighten the beginning of your week with a few words about the Memorial Scrolls Trust and our Czech Torah collection. Before I share my screen, I'll just say that I really like doing these talks from this room, because over my shoulder you can see there's a whole bunch of baby pictures from my two children. And I am about to tell you a miraculous story that involves Jewish heroism and resistance, but it's really all about Lador Vidor, from generation to generation. And this is why I keep my children's pictures just behind me while I talk to you tonight. These Torah scrolls are so special and so unique, and their legacy is amazing. And now that you're going to hear the journey of the Torah scroll that you have in your ark, I promise you, you'll never look at it the same way again. So I'm going to share my screen because I brought along a lot of pictures. So bear with me for just one moment while I share. Okay, can you see the blue slides? Okay, fantastic. If there's a problem with the audio or the visual anywhere along the way, just unmute and let me know. And if I can advance forward, we'll be all set. Okay, I like to start here. What is a Torah scroll? Of course, you know what a Torah scroll is. It's the handmade copy of the 5 books of Moses. It's written on parchment, which is animal skin by a sofer or a soferet these days, with a quill pen and special ink. These traditions are passed down from one sofer to another. It's an apprenticeship type of learning, and it takes 1 entire year to handwrite a Torah scroll. They're highly ritualistic when we use them, as we know in the synagogue. They're highly ritualistic when they're written. So I like to start off with this photograph. This is what you're used to seeing. A Torah scroll standing vertically in a wooden ark with a mantle or the white covering, with the silver hanging around it, the ornaments, the tinkly bells on the Etz Chaim. Beautiful example of a Torah scroll. But as I go forward in my talk, unfortunately, not all the Torah scrolls you're about to see are going to look like this. Right off the bat, I'm going to talk about geography because I'm going to use the words Bohemia and Moravia often, and I want to be clear about what I'm saying. This blue map is the current day Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is made up of two ancient kingdoms. On the western half is the ancient kingdom of Bohemia, and on the eastern half is the ancient kingdom of Moravia. There was a country created after World War I called Czechoslovakia, and it was the merging together of these Czech lands with the country of Slovakia. They were put together by the Western leaders after World War I because the languages are similar, but really the cultures are not similar. And we are going to exclusively talk about the Czech portion of Czechoslovakia because that's where all of our Torah scrolls came from. You see a lot of little black dots on the map. These represent the 150 collection towns. There were more than 300 small towns where Jews lived in Bohemia and Moravia, but some of the villages were very, very small. And at the time that the Nazis invaded and collected the Judaica, they took Torah scrolls from very small farming communities and brought them to the collection town. And from the collection town, they were sent to Prague. And so that's why you only see about 150 dots rather than the 300 of where the Jews were. I'll also point out that you don't see any black dots on the western portion of the blue map. The Czech lands sit squarely in Central Europe. They border with Germany on the west, Austria on the south, and Poland on the east. The Jews that lived in these lands had much more in common with the German Jews and Viennese Jews than they did with the shtetl Jews in Eastern Europe. This is important because many of the Jews, especially around the beginning of World War II, were quite assimilated. There was a 35% intermarriage rate with the Czechs and the local Germans living in these lands, because all of this area was originally the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and German was the language of the land. There was a lot of movement back and forth from Vienna to Prague and Prague to Germany. And so, when we talk about the Czechs, Europe, especially from like the late 1800s until the outbreak of World War II, had a lot of different minority groups within the borders. It's very confusing population when we talk about individual countries. So anyway, the western portion where there's no little black dots was called the Sudetenland. And that portion of Czechoslovakia was part of Germany before World War I. And after World War I, when Germany lost, the Western powers split up Germany and gave this portion of Sudetenland to the Czechoslovakia Empire. And so in a second, I'll explain why there's no black dots there, but keep that in mind. That's called the Sudetenland. I show you on the map where the big city of Prague is. Maybe some of you have visited. It's gorgeous. I highly recommend if you're in Europe, you stop there. And I've also shown you where the little town of Horovice is. And I apologize for my Czech pronunciation. I do the best I can. So the small town where the Czech scroll is from your congregation is southwest of Prague. There were 1,000 years of Jewish history in this area of Central Europe. And here you see a picture of the Alt New Synagogue, which is in Prague. It was built in 1270 and still stands today in Prague. You can go in and visit and take a tour. The Jews were alternatively invited in and kicked out in this area over hundreds of years. They were invited in to serve as bankers and invited to live in certain plots of land so that they could be taxed very highly. During this time, the Jews lived in small areas, living mostly within their own communities. They were traditional, or what we would consider Orthodox Jews early on. And when a new leader would come in or a new ruler, they'd be kicked out and have to move a few kilometers down the road to another area. This went on back and forth over the thousands of years. I also want to mention the story of the Golem. Many of you have heard about this Jewish monster. The golem actually goes back thousands of years in Jewish tradition, but there was a rabbi living in Prague in the late 16th century named Rabbi Lowy. He's quite famous, and he's associated with the legend of the golem. And here's an etching of the rabbi conjuring up the Jewish monster, the golem. And it was said that if you said special incantations over a lump of clay or dirt, that a Jewish monster would rise up to protect the Jewish community during times of strife. And when the world settled down again, we didn't need the golem. Different words could be said by the rabbis in the know, and the monster would fall back down into a lump of clay. Well, the legend goes that Rabbi Lowy indeed needed some protection for his community during his reign as a rabbi. He made the golem, he made it disappear, he scooped up the dirt, and he deposited it in the attic of the Alt New synagogue over on the left. So when you're in Prague and you're visiting the large Jewish museum and community there, and you go inside the synagogue, try to get up to the attic. If you walk around the back of the Alt New synagogue, you can actually see a ladder that goes up to a door into the attic. And if you find some dirt in the corner, that's the golem monster, just waiting to be rediscovered. So I have here a few pictures of what it looked like in the Jewish quarter in Prague. On the left, you see some Jewish stores. You see Cohen as a name at the top left. Obviously, they're selling wares, and my guess is that most of these people in the picture are Jews in Prague. In the center, you see one of the inner courtyards of what the housing looked like around the turn of the century in Prague. Well, a special thing happened in these lands in the mid-19th century. Around 1848, the concept of emancipation, which started really in France at the French Revolution and in America in the Revolution, where all men were created equal and everyone could be citizens of the land, finally came to Central Europe. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire under Franz Joseph allowed Jews to become citizens, 1848. Most of the Jews I mentioned were living in their own little communities. This allowed the Jews to spread out all around the world, and they could enter university without any quotas. They could start businesses. They had all the rights of the citizens of the land. And the Jews left these cramped quarters in cities like Prague and Brno and Pilsen and went into the farming communities. For those of you that haven't spent time in the Czech lands, it's very fertile land. There's a lot of different crops, there's silver mines, and the Jews moved from the big cities to these smaller towns. They were welcomed by the Czechs. They had no problem with anti-Semitism. They would take a corner of the main square and build a synagogue building. They would build a rabbi's house, sometimes a mikveh, sometimes a school. And the Jews lived very harmoniously with the Czechs from the mid-1800s over the turn of the 20th century. By about 1906, the city planners in Prague decided that they wanted to get rid of some of this old housing, dilapidated, overcrowded, ugly buildings and make the city look prettier. So they started to knock down these types of houses that you see in the middle picture. And there were tucked into these communities prayer houses. I don't really say there were synagogues. They were more like one-room schoolhouses that had Judaica inside, and they were kind of abandoned because a lot of the Jews had moved to the countryside. So the Jewish community of Prague started collecting Judaica, mostly silver candlesticks and implements of Judaica, and they opened a Jewish museum in 1906. Nowadays, we have Jewish museums all over the place. We have Holocaust museums, we have Jewish museums, but museums are a new phenomena in human civilization. And in 1906, this was only the third Jewish museum on the entire planet. One was in Frankfurt, one was in another German city, or maybe in Vienna, and this one in Prague. So pretty important. They had about 500 or 700 pieces of silver that they put on display in the old Jewish ceremonial hall, which is right next to the ancient Jewish cemetery in the Jewish quarter in the city of Prague. Well, people would visit that, Jews, non-Jews, visitors to the big city. Life was pretty bucolic for the Jews that lived in this area for many decades. Of course, we know that during the 1930s, Germany, the Western neighbor, was going through a lot. And that's putting it mildly. We saw the rise of the Nazi Party. We saw, Hitler implementing the Nuremberg laws. We saw life getting harder and harder for German citizens. And the Jews in the Czech lands right next door were very, very concerned. So many Jewish Czechs tried to get out of the Czech lands. Now, many of them had made money by opening factories in the countryside, and they used their middle-class wealth, although I don't think we'd call them middle class at that time, and to buy their way out. And many Czech Jews came to the United States or Canada. Many went to Palestine. Many went to Western Europe, France, and England. Well, we know that the Nazis were, kind of shaking it up a little bit. And the Western allies wanted to appease Hitler. They thought, look, we're worried about this guy, but what he really wants to do is reunite Germany. Let's give him the western portion of the Czech lands called Sudetenland. Remember the map? And if we give him that land, maybe he'll shut up. That's all he wants. He wants to reunite Germany. We'll give him that. Well, in 1938, under the Munich Agreement, they did just that. The minute that Germany took over those lands, in came the bulldozers and the tanks, and they came to every synagogue in that portion of the Czech lands, and they set the synagogues on fire and started to make the Jews move either to Prague or they deported them back to whatever country they originally came from. And the Czech Jews were panicking. That was 1938. It didn't appease Hitler. Within 6 months, the Germans invaded Bohemia and Moravia on their way to Poland, starting World War II. So on the right, I show you a Czechoslovakian passport. Believe me, if you had a Czech passport in 1938 or 39, you were trying to get out and go just about anywhere you possibly could that was far away from the Nazi Party. Now, I could go on and on about World War II history or Holocaust history, but that's not why you asked me to come here tonight. So I'm going to reserve the rest of my remarks to talk about how it came to pass that 1,500 Torah scrolls survived the Shoah and came to London, and one of them ends up in your ark. And I'm going to frame my story by talking about 4 miracles. So here we go. Miracle number 1. This is a picture of Torah scrolls. Very different than the first picture that I showed you. These scrolls are unrolled, they're ripped, they're laying on the ground. This is what happened to the Torah scrolls that were in the Sudetenland when the Nazis first arrived. And if they didn't set the synagogue on fire, they ransacked it. And the Jewish community in Prague was aware of this. And they were very, very concerned about what was going to happen to the 1,000 years of Judaica, 1,000 years of history in Bohemia and Moravia. So when the Nazis came, they set up shop in Prague, but life was very different for the Jews in Prague than it was in Warsaw. When the Nazis arrived in Poland, within just a very short period of time, they set up the ghetto, they made all the Jews move to a certain area of the city, and then it got worse and worse and worse, as we know. In this area, though, I mentioned that there were a lot of German citizens in the Czech lands. And this was the first place that the Nazis invaded after Vienna. So they allowed the Jews to stay in their homes. They weren't allowed to go to university, and some of them had restrictions on life, but there were still Jewish services taking place at the beginning of the occupation by the Nazis, which meant that the Jews could still talk about what was going on. And of course, like the Nazis did everywhere, they appointed the Jewish community to be the Judenrat, but it wasn't called that, in Prague. And they asked the Jewish community to do certain things. One thing they asked was for the Jewish community to write a letter to all of the smaller communities, 300 of them, dotted around the Czech lands, to send their silver and ancient manuscripts to Prague so that the Nazi officials could collect all of these very rare books. Now, that did not mean Torah scrolls. That meant books in the libraries dotted around the country. The Nazis were fascinated by history and ancient texts. We don't know whether they wanted to collect them maybe to create their own narrative of world history, but nevertheless, the letter went out, and small parcels started to come to the Jewish Museum, where the curators were opening boxes and sifting through ancient books that were sent there. And most of the curators at the museum and most of the leaders of the Jewish community in Prague were also part of the resistance movement in the Czech lands. And they realized that they had an opportunity. They went to the Nazi official and they said, "We did what you asked, and things are coming to Prague, and here are some of the examples of ancient manuscripts. But you know, we're museum curators, and we're used to collecting items and artifacts. How about we send letters to the Jewish communities and tell them to send every movable artifact, and we can collect them and sift through and get the very best items for you, Mr. Nazi." Well, the Nazi in charge thought that was a great idea because he didn't really care about all of these other items called Judaica. He only wanted the ancient books, and he allowed that to happen. So they sent a second letter, and that coincided with the beginning of the deportations to the concentration camp Terezin, or Theresienstadt in German. Well, boxes and boxes started to come to Prague, and over the course of 1 year, the Jewish curators at the museum cataloged over 200,000 items of Judaica from every one of those small towns where Jews lived. It included the Torah scrolls, but it also included candelabras, prayer books, benches, Elijah chairs, ner tamid, curtains, you name it, they folded it up and sent it. And the Jews were then beginning to be deported from all the little towns to the concentration camp. Well, after about a year of this collection working as hard as they could behind the scenes, they cataloged everything, they put it away by like items, so all of the Torah scrolls were in one place, all the candlesticks in another. Even the curators that were feverishly working hard were eventually deported to Terezin. That brings me to miracle number 2. There were about 118,000 Jews left in the Czech lands when the Nazis invaded, and about 10,000 survived the Shoah. When they were released from the concentration camps or could come out of hiding on the Aryan side, several thousand Jews came back to Prague, and one of the survivors happened to be one of the collectors, one of the curators from the Jewish Museum at the beginning of the war. I'm showing you this picture, which is within the Jewish quarter today. It's the town square. And yes, there are 2 clocks, one with Roman numerals and one with Hebrew numbers. Both clocks work, by the way. And when the curator came back to Prague, an amazing thing was discovered. Very few bombs fell on Prague during the war. That meant that the collection, which was stored in 40 warehouses all over Prague, survived. Warsaw was leveled, Munich was leveled, Berlin was leveled, but the Prague building stood. Well, the Jews didn't come back, but the Judaica was there. So she took over the reins of the museum again, and she started to figure out what she was going to do with everything. This is 1945, 46. In 1948, the communists officially took over in Prague for the Czech lands. The communists had absolutely no use for the Judaica, and she went to the now communist government and said, listen, 40 buildings here in Prague are being used to house our archive. I'm sure that the communist government would like to use that space for something better. Do you mind if we move some of our archive to the outskirts of Prague? To which they said, of course, the first place she went was to the Torah scrolls. And she, along with some other Jewish survivors, moved the boxes of Torah scrolls from the center of Prague to the outskirts to an abandoned synagogue called the Mikli Synagogue. Now, this synagogue had been abandoned way before the war. Its roof was leaky, its windows were broken, and you may know that in Central Europe, the winters are snowy and cold and the summers are hot. There were mice running around, not ideal conditions to store Torah scrolls, but nevertheless, they built wooden racks and they lined up the Torah scrolls that were in these giant bags. The bags were tied with a string and there was a little label hanging off of it that said, "This is Torah scroll from the town of Pilsen, written in 1850. The Torah scrolls sat in the Mikli Synagogue from 1948 until the early 1960s, which brings me to miracle number 3. In the early 1960s, the communist government was strapped for cash. They were broke, and they needed to find sources of money. Well, what better asset to sell than a useless group of Jewish items? Torah scrolls. And of course, the West might be interested in that. So the communist government reached out first to the Israeli government and said, "Hey, you're a Jewish state. You want to buy this from us?" Well, it was bad timing for Israel, and they declined. So during that time, art dealers from London were given special visas during the Cold War to go to the East in places like Prague, buy art, bring it back to the West, and sell it. And for those of you that might not remember, there was a giant concrete wall built to separate the East from the West, and communication was very difficult. People didn't have free movement the way we do today. And so people in the West didn't know what was going on in the East. Well, Eric Esterick, the art dealer from London, went to Prague. He was approached by, I'm ad-libbing, but maybe a trench coat wearing, hat wearing spy, I don't mean spy, person from the communist government who tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Would you like to buy some Judaica?" Well, he came back to London, and one of his clients, customers, was Ralph Yablon, who was a member of this synagogue. This is the Westminster Synagogue in Knightsbridge, London. It's a very affluent community. You can see the building is big marble. It's got trees. It's right along the park. And Ralph was stunned. And he said, "Really? There's actually Judaica left in the East? We should bring it to the West and save it." So he paid 20,000 American dollars for the contents of the Mikli Synagogue and really didn't know what was going to arrive or if it was going to arrive. Well, on a rainy Sunday afternoon in December of 1964, 2 trucks pulled up to the front door of this building, and the congregants to do a mitzvah came to unload the truck. Well, they carried off these enormous gray bags, some of them 2 or 3 feet long, with the Torah scrolls inside. And first they filled up all the tables and then all the chairs on the first floor of the building, then the second floor, then the third floor, then the roof level. 1,564 bags came off the 2 trucks. They couldn't believe it. They came in, they said, "Rabbi, please, can we open some of the bags and see what's inside?" They couldn't believe their eyes. They opened the bags, they pulled out the scrolls. Some were burnt, some had bullet holes, some had blood stains. And a few of them had little notes tucked in the rolls of the scrolls that said in Czech or German, "Please remember us. What's to become of us?" Well, it was clear then that this was a mission that was bigger than one man or one synagogue. And the people at the Westminster Synagogue started the charity, the predecessor of the Memorial Scrolls Trust. They put the entire scroll collection into this nonprofit with the mission to use the scrolls as memorials for remembering the Czech Jews that perished in the Holocaust, but by association, the 6 million. And they started fixing up the scrolls, and this brings me to miracle number 4. In the first few years after the scrolls arrived in London, letters came pouring into the Westminster Synagogue. Please, we have a congregation in Canada with survivors. We would love to have one of those scrolls sent to us. How do we make that happen? We got letters from every European country, Australia, South Africa, obviously America, and they started to send the scrolls out on permanent loan. One by one. Every single scroll was given as an act of love. With correspondence, if you think before the internet, letter correspondence that had to go airmail from wherever they were in the world to the Westminster Synagogue, where Ruth Schaffer, who was one of the congregants, stepped forward and said, I would be the administrator of this charity. And she hand typed every letter back to congregations, back and forth, sending out 1,400 of the scrolls into the diaspora. They're at museums, libraries, and schools all around the world. Every once in a while, we get one back because a congregation closes and we reallocate it. So we still, to this day, send new scrolls out, about 10 or 15 every year. The rest of the 1,564 that we have in the collection, about 150 of them are too fragile to travel, and they're in our museum in London. If you're ever in London, please, please come and see our museum. We have the 150 scrolls. We have 400 binders that were wrapped around the Torah scrolls, and many other oddities that we've collected from the Czech lands. So let me talk about the collection in general for just a second. On the left, you see a scroll that was clearly in a fire. And I like to say that it might have been the rabbi who went running into the burning synagogue to grab the scroll, but it might have been one of the non-Jewish Czech neighbors in the town. There was limited anti-Semitism before the war. The Czechs were also living in difficult times with the Nazi occupation, and there was a lot of intermarriage. And so it could easily have been a non-Jewish person running into the building to grab this sacred scroll. In the center is a picture inside one of our scrolls. There are a lot of Kabbalistic letters and writing styles in our scrolls. Every Torah that's written has to be perfect. Every letter has to be legible. Every seam has to be perfect. But the scribes writing in the Central Europe at the time took a lot of liberties with putting Kabbalistic letters into the scrolls that we don't see nowadays. For example, in the center of this picture, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but this letter is a pei. Yes. And the pei has an extra curl inside of it. You would not see that in a scroll today. It's called a pei within a pei. It's a Kabbalistic way of writing the letter. There are many explanations for what it means. The best one I ever heard is that the pei represents the mouth. And if you put a mouth inside a mouth, you should swallow your mouth, or you should listen more than you speak. There are also very interesting backwards lamids and unusual sizing of letters. Some scrolls have them, some scrolls don't. So if you get a chance to open your scroll at some point, you might want to look through and see if you can find some of these amazing writing styles. The bottom is a Torah binder. That's literally the type of fabric that holds the scroll together when you're going to put the mantle on and put it back in the ark. This one is in the Czech language, and it says, to the honor and glory of God. The reason I'm showing it to you is to remind you how assimilated the Czech Jews were. You might think that something so sacred that's going to be touching our Torah scroll would be in Hebrew, but the Czechs spoke Czech, and so they wrote this in the Czech language. And then on the right-hand side is a photograph inside one of our Haftarah scrolls. The vast majority of our collection are Torah scrolls, but we have a handful of Haftarah scrolls and a few Megillah scrolls. This one has the cantillation markings on it. It's very, very unusual. Now let's turn to your scroll. You take care of scroll number 558. It's one of the oldest congregants you have. It was written around 1875, making it 150 years old. And as I mentioned, it's from the town of Horovice. Now, this is super interesting because you thought it was from a different town. And when we corresponded with your temple, when it was shipped in 1983, we thought it was from the town of Horozovice. And on the lower left, you see the original card that was filled out by hand by a scribe when they first looked at this particular scroll when it came to London in 1964. You can imagine how busy they were. 1,500 scrolls. They all needed to be cataloged and assessed and looked at as quick as they could. So frankly, they probably just wrote the wrong town down. Now, the two towns have similar letters in them. They're about an hour and a half car drive away from one another. And so honestly, if you went to one and then you went to the other, they would look like little towns in the rolling hills of Bohemia. So I'm going to tell you that you should think about the town of Horowice as the place where the scroll was used. But frankly, it could be any one of the small towns in that portion of Bohemia. In our total collection, there are 17 scrolls that supposedly came from this little farming village, Horowice. At the max, the town had only a few hundred Jews. I really doubt they had 17 scrolls in their ark. So some of the scrolls came from the other villages nearby. They were brought to this slightly larger town and then sent to Prague during the collection. On the right is the actual letter from your shul that was sent asking for the scrolls. And if you want, after you can contact me and I'll actually send you digital images of all of the correspondence. Let's talk about the Jews that lived in this town. They built their shul in 1904 when they had the maximum number of Jews in town. This is the building on the right. It still stands today if you were to go visit. On the left are the original plans, so you can see how beautiful the synagogue building was. It's been pared down after the Nazis came, and it's been operating since 1947 as the Czech Brethren Protestant Church, but it's still there in the town. We find in a lot of the little towns in the Czech lands that the local people maintain the synagogue buildings or the rabbis' houses. They've spent their own money to renovate them. If they're not being used as churches, they're being used as museums or cultural centers. This is inside the synagogue. Now it's a church now, but that's clearly a bima, right? That's clearly the ark, the indented portion at the front. And I want you to think for a second that your scroll in your ark today would have been standing in that ark space behind wooden doors. Jews arrived in this town in the 1400s, then they got kicked out, then they were invited back in the mid-1800s. There were a couple hundred Jews by the time the synagogue was built. And it might be interesting to know that many Jewish families that have the last name of Horowitz or Hurwitz can actually trace their ancestry back to this town. The Jews that were left in this town when the Nazis invaded were deported to Terezin, and only a few of the Jews from this town survived. Most were killed. Here's a listing of some of the Jews that we know were murdered during the Shoah. And by caring for your scroll number 558, you're carrying on the legacy of these people. I want you to just think for a second that these were the people who would come to Saturday morning services, to Rosh Hashanah services, to Yom Kippur services and Simchas Torah, and dance proudly with the scrolls around that synagogue building. Here they are, but they're not with us today. MST has a lot of projects that continue to keep us strong. One is we do a lot of these Zoom talks and we visit congregations that have our scrolls. We also have a few books that we've published recently. If you've liked the photographs in my talk, they come from a book called Light Beyond the Shadows. A volunteer named Sheila Pele went to the Czech lands with her husband and lived there for 3.5 months. She's a photographer, and she went to the 150 collection towns and took photographs of all that was left Judaically. And she has amazing, amazing photos in this book of all of the redone synagogue buildings and how beautiful they are. We just published an updated story about our organization and the scrolls called 1564, and that's available on our website. And we have other programs in process. We're doing a series of scroll gatherings across the world to celebrate our 60th anniversary. We're having a big gathering in New York City in April. We're having a gathering in London at the beginning of February. There's one in Buenos Aires, there's one in Prague, there's one in Florida, all over. If you're interested, you should look at our newsletter. And we're also trying to digitize as many of the scrolls as possible. We're asking congregants to take photos of certain parts of the scrolls, and we're hoping that if we can get a big enough collection of photos, there would be some PhD researchers, academics that would be interested in doing some studies about the specialness of our collection. Now, we've held gatherings in the past. In 2019, before COVID, we had a massive gathering of 75 of our scrolls in New York City. Here's a photograph of these scrolls. And I like this picture because in the foreground, you see the scrolls with the mantles, that's the fabric covering. In the bottom of the picture, the blue and white stripes from reminiscent of the concentration camp clothing, a white talit as a memorial. But if you look down the row, you see very colorful mantles. And this is the Lador Vador. We have brought these scrolls into our lives. They've been given second lives, sometimes third lives. They're cherished by the congregations that use them, that carry them proudly around. Whether they can be read from or not, they're cherished by Jews today. And I thought that gathering was so special, I brought a 1-minute video to show you what it's like. Hopefully it works on Zoom. As the Torah scrolls pass by the camera, I want you to realize that each one of these scrolls is a messenger from a community in the Czech lands that no longer survives. There are no more Czechs, no more Jews in the Czech lands. There's been a resurgence of a few thousand Jews now, but it hasn't been a continuous world. So as each one comes by, each one represents a different town. That was less than 5% of our entire collection of scrolls. So on behalf of Memorial Scrolls Trust, thank you for caring for scroll 558 and for caring for the other scrolls at the other locations in Western Canada and Northwestern United States. If there's anything that we can ever do to provide more information for you, we would love to do that. I'm going to stop my sharing now, and I'd be happy to take questions.
I think Raul has a question that he typed into the.
Okay, Lois, what happened to the silver Judaica items and books that came with the Torah scrolls from the rural synagogues to Prague? The 200,000 objects that were collected are now the archives of the Jewish Museum of Prague. And if you haven't been to Prague, the museum has taken over the ancient synagogue buildings in the Jewish Quarter. There are about 4 or 6 buildings where the museum displays different types of objects, but they have a vast amount of objects in boxes in the archives, and they're slowly digitizing everything and putting it up on the website. So if you're looking for a certain town or certain objects, you can go to the website of the Jewish Museum of Prague and see all those things. It's just incredible.
Yeah, sure.
Lois, just a quick question. Do you know what the state of our 558 Torah is right now?
Well, you can ask Gila.
Or Gila? Are you familiar?
Wait, you're
no-
Okay, I'm sorry, I haven't opened it. Maybe I opened it once, but I didn't go through the whole scroll. But I understand that we can't read from it, that it's not in a state where you can read. But we should open it and look at the whole thing. Let's see if we find some of those Kabbalistic letters anywhere.
Oh, we
Yes.
did. Remember, we took pictures of some of those.
Yes,
things.
that's when we did. Nachon. And maybe we should add those photos when we make the web page. We should
That
add
would be
Tammy's
great.
photos. That would be really beautiful. Nachon. So we did that. But we didn't look at the whole scroll.
Yeah.
So we need to open the whole scroll.
Is that Torah scroll, is it a possibility to restore it to a condition where it can be used?
So I don't know. You would have to have a scribe come and look at it. But it's interesting that you asked that question. Many congregations today are looking at our scrolls and finding scribes that come and say, in fact, yes, we can repair. Some of the scrolls are in amazingly good condition, even though they're currently pasul. And there are a couple of sofars and sofarettes that are authorized by the trust to work on our collection. And we don't let any sofer work on the collection because we want to make sure that if they bring the scroll up to snuff, that they do it by keeping the Kabbalistic letters in the scroll. And we make an agreement with them that they will adhere to what the standards of scribe writing was in the 1800s in the Czech lands and not what is done today.
I see. So follow-up question. Do we have any authorized soifers in Canada?
I think there are. I can get the list if you want me to from London sent out. And a lot of the scribes are very mobile these days, so they don't even need to live in Canada to work on the scrolls. They travel and ship things.
That would be actually wonderful because one of our other scrolls needs a sofer or soferet. So we've been talking about this as one of the upcoming fundraisers we need to do. So if you could send us a list, that would be amazing.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Or
So a
thoughts?
lot of people ask me if any scrolls are currently in the Czech lands. And the answer is yes, we have 2 scrolls that we've sent back to the Czech lands. The first one went to a town in Moravia called Alamush, where there is a Jewish community practicing. And they wrote to London maybe 7 or 8 or 9 years ago and said, we're here in Alamush. Do you have any of the scrolls that used to come from our synagogue building? And we did. Unfortunately, we had lent it on permanent loan to a congregation in California. So we called the congregation in California and we said, you know, we've never done this before, but here's the story. And the congregation said, we're not going to just send it back to you in London. We're going to spend some money to have the sofer work on it, and we're going to bring it to Alamush. And half the congregation got on a plane and went to this town in Moravia. And if you go on YouTube, you can find the videos of the pass-off ceremony. It was unbelievable. The second scroll went back to Prague just during the pandemic. There's a new liberal rabbi named Rabbi David Maxa, who has a very fast-growing liberal congregation in Prague. And we gave him a scroll that came from a Reform Jewish camp in New York that was closing. And when he was a student, he used to spend time at that camp in New York from Prague. And it has a special place in his heart. So the Reform movement koshered it and sent it back to him in Prague.
Thank you. I saw Caitlin. Caitlin, did you want to ask a question? Because it seemed like you unmuted.
I did. Well, I just wanted to say that we'd be very interested in receiving that list as well. We haven't properly opened or photographed our Torah either. And it's kind of, if we could do that with somebody there to take a look at it too and kind of do it all at once, that would be great.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Your scroll comes from Prague, at least that was the collection point. And it was written in 1850. So it is something that you should take a look at.
Yeah.
Because we don't want the scrolls to disintegrate, right? If you don't roll the scrolls, they get moldy and they fall apart. And, you know, then we have even more problems than we already have. Other questions?
Can I just thank you so much? It is so lovely to have a piece of positive, to listen to a positive story. Thank you for bringing that to us. We really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Paula, I thought I saw you on mute, but maybe you just unmuted.
No, Hank did read from that Torah scroll once. A long time ago. He felt very strongly that he wanted to read from it. And I don't know whether it was at the high holidays, it was at was at a service, and he did unroll it, and he did, even though it is not a kosher scroll, he felt, I think it was around the time of his conversion, and he felt very, very strongly that he wanted to read from that scroll, and he did. But I think he's one of the last people who's read from it.
I have the wonderful vantage point of visiting with so many scroll holders, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Havara, you know, everything, and hear what they do with their scrolls. So I mentioned that there were the list of the victims from the town where your scroll had been collected. A lot of people will incorporate Kaddish for those victims at some point during the year. Some people will simply add one person to every Shabbat list. Other times they'll take a special Shabbat and they'll read all the names. Sometimes during Yom HaShoah or International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom Kippur, you know, it's every organization finds a different way of commemorating. But it's lovely if you can find a way of incorporating that into your synagogue life. Congregations that have Hebrew schools have the kids sometimes look at the scroll the day before their bar or bat mitzvah. And if they can, open the scroll to their parsha. They can't read from it at the bar or bat mitzvah, but they can see it and they can hold the wooden rollers and hear the story and understand that there were many children that were 12 and a half and didn't get to read their parsha from that scroll, even though they were preparing. And it really impacts the kids for sure. Some congregations go on a trip and go visit the town, go visit Prague or make a whole excursion, all kinds of things. Okay. Well, you've been a wonderful, wonderful audience. I hope you've learned things. I hope that when you open your Ark next, you look at that scroll and realize that it's something more than you knew it was yesterday.
And Lois, you've been wonderful, and you just made it come to life for me. You made the scroll. I mean, it was sitting there. We looked at it. I told the Bnei Mitzvah kids about it. I told guests about it, but it suddenly has a personality. So thank you so much for bringing this back to life for us and making it real and giving us all these good ideas, Ken, for how to continue
Have a
dealing
wonderful
with it.
everyone.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Thank you so much. And thank you. And thank you, Gila. This was really your idea to make this happen. So thank you.
My pleasure. Toda rabba.
Yeah, it's great. Well, every Shavua Tov.